You're listening to UNITEDWESTRIKE.com radio. Don't buy, don't comply. That's why. UNITEDWESTRIKE.com radio.
Welcome back, folks, to the first United We Strike radio marathon broadcast of 2011. We just finished up with Lorraine Moret, who spoke about depleted uranium and how toxic it is, and also the fact that it is everywhere, folks, and what we don't know definitely is hurting us, and it's time to really learn about what's going on, what happened in our history that brought us to this point today. And speaking of that, now I'm just honored and privileged to have as my next guest a great historian and a woman who has really done a lot of writing and research, and that is Deanna Spingola. She hosts regularly Spingola Speaks on republicbroadcasting.org. Welcome to the program, Deanna.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I have been looking forward to meeting you for quite a while, and I've got your article, Before Rockefeller There Was Rothschild, up on taxfree15.com on the Educate page, and boy, what an eye-opener that was.
Right. We often don't go back far enough, and we think that we have it all down and that we know where things originated from, and sometimes that just isn't the way it is.
Well, how did you get into this? Before we delve into that, what made you get into this movement and begin to raise your voice?
I've actually been interested in history, and are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh,
just listening.
Okay. Okay. Oh, I think you muted yourself, and I thought, oh, what's going on? I've always been interested in history. Always loved history in school, and I started writing for News with Views about 6 years ago. And then I just kind of expanded, but actually I guess it was, oh my word, maybe even 20 years ago, I really started thinking, longer, maybe 30 years ago, that I thought there's something really drastically wrong here. Things are not the way that they're supposed to be. Things are getting worse for the middle class. And it just seemed like the government, no matter what, simply could not help, or they were just so stupid or inefficient that they didn't know what to do. And that's just too bizarre to have all these people who are supposedly serving the best interests of the country, and yet the country is going to heck in a handbasket. And there had to be some reason for this. And so I started investigating things. First, I think the first book that I read was, what was the first book? I still have it on my shelf. It was by Gary Allen. It was about conspiracy. And then he wrote a few other books along with some other gentlemen. And I read that, and then I read his Rockefeller file and discovered that the bankers, and then the Federal Reserve, and then if you just tie this in with biblical quotations and biblical knowledge of what it talks about in the Bible about money and the love of money and greed and all of that, you just start putting all this stuff together and kind of map it out and connect the dots, and pretty soon you kind of have a picture, and then you just start filling in. And that's basically what I've been doing is filling in a lot of those details.
Well, now you talk here in this article, which I would like to highlight, because I thought this article was just so amazing, and I remember when I first discovered it, I think that it was sent to me by one of the people who supports United We Strike in this movement in an email, and I spoke about it, I think, for the next 2 weeks or so. Every time I did an interview, I would talk about it because it just makes so much sense. It lays out all the steps.
And that article is before Rockefeller, there was Rothschild?
Yes, and you've got here how in 1773 that Mayor Rothschild summoned 12 wealthy men and asked them to pool their resources.
You know, that is not... I wrote that probably, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I don't know that that's documentary evidence. It is theory, but I'm not certain that you could call it documentary.
Okay. So what about the 25 points?
The 25 points. Now that is definite. Actually, there are more. There are about 45. If you look at the Illuminati, and that's what that article kind of delves into, is the Illuminati. And basically, if you compare the Illuminati goals with the goals in the Communist Manifesto, you will find that they're pretty much the exact same goals. And the goals are. Would you like me to go through them?
Yes, please.
Okay. Let me just hang on just a minute. Number one, and the goals that I'm referring to were put into the congressional record in 1963, on January 10th, 1963. And they are... Do we have commercial breaks?
No, actually we go to about 5 minutes before the top of the hour. And so you can relax and we can touch on these as in-depth or as lightly as you would like.
Oh, okay. Okay. And I'd also like to talk about total war, because total war is very significant.
You know, Deanna, I tell you what, you have the floor here. You talk about whatever you want, and we can refer people to your articles and link them on tax-free. And you know much more about this than I do, so I'm willing to just give you the floor and let you lead the way.
Okay. Okay, the Illuminati objectives are, number one, U.S. acceptance of coexistence as the only alternative to atomic war. And basically that's just sort of a method or a strategy to get everybody to accept globalism, to all join together in something that has been called various things throughout the ages, the Parliament of Man, the League of Nations, and we know it now as the United Nations. Basically, it's coexistence as the only way to prevent atomic war. And, of course, the atomic bomb was dropped by the United States twice, actually just twice formally, but they tested it otherwise, was dropped in 1945 after the Japanese offered to surrender. They started offering to surrender in the fall of 1944. But the bombs weren't ready. They were ready to deliver, and so the U.S. government simply ignored, that would be Roosevelt and Truman after Roosevelt passed away. They both ignored Japan's offer to unconditionally surrender, because they want to test these bombs on somebody, and that's who they had chosen.
Do you think also, when we mention the Illuminati, that this was a blood sacrifice?
Oh, sure. I mean, okay, presumably. And you'll find that there are evidences that is what it is, but they don't write everything down, and so we get to a lot of this through circumstantial evidence, which is why I say, okay, now Rothschild may have gotten together with a group of his friends. he may have chosen 25 or 15 or a certain number of the objectives that they wanted to implement, but they didn't write it down and they didn't disseminate the information. And so all we can do is go from circumstances. In other words, circumstantial evidence. And circumstantial evidence is quite compelling. I'm not saying that it's that it's not a compelling thing, but it's still circumstantial. It's the same thing when you look at the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. You can say, well, that's really compelling, and we think we know who wrote it. And when you go through history and you look at what is happening now, you can say, oh, well, gosh, it must be true because, see, it's all coming true, and so somebody must have written this down, and there seems to be some actual protocols here that are telling people, okay, we're going to implement this procedure, we're going to do this, and after we do that, we're going to do something else. And you can say the same thing about the presentation or the objectives that a Dr. Day gave at a symposium in 1969, and which is also very interesting, and which seems to be coming true. And in fact, he even said that there was going to be abortion, and he delivered this speech on March 20th, 1969, and that was way before abortion. And he gave a whole list of the things that was going to happen, and what do you know? It happened. And he had gotten very elderly. He was a doctor. He was a practicing physician. He was also an instructor at one of the major medical hospitals. And inasmuch as he was getting old, he thought, I'm going to divulge this information. However, he told everybody in the audience, you are not to do any recording. You're not to make any notes. You just have to listen. But there was another doctor who did have quite a good memory and was able to write it down after the fact. But anyway, so we're talking about coexistence, and then the second thing in this list of items that came out of the January 10th, 1963 congressional record was that the U.S. would be willing to capitulate in preference to engaging in atomic war. In other words, we would do pretty much whatever the communists wanted us to do. Now, the whole objective of the Second World War, or one of the objectives of the Second World War, was to sacrifice Europe, most of Europe, to the communists. In other words, when the U.S. government, Franklin D. Roosevelt, deliberately placed General Dwight D. Eisenhower, in position as Supreme Commander in Europe. And he moved him, he elevated him over and above as many as 100 other military people, most of whom were his senior. They outranked him. And yet he was positioned within a period of maybe 6 or 7 months. And all of a sudden, he's the Supreme Commander in Europe. And so they put their man in place. And when it came time for the U.S. Army to move east to block the communists, there was a stand down. Now, a stand down that happened in 2001 too. That the U.S. government, the U.S. response team, in charge of protecting us, stood down and allowed something to happen on 9/11. And so in Europe, they used the same tactic, and they just simply didn't move east and allowed the communists to liberate, quote unquote, liberate Poland and numerous other countries, and actually go in and liberate Berlin. And of course, the Soviets had told their troops to rape and pillage every single female that they came across, and so it was a very, very devastating war. But the U.S. government allowed that to occur because they wanted to debilitate, destabilize many of those Eastern European countries, and of course they wanted to destabilize Germany. So the U.S. was willing to capitulate in preference. Okay, and the other thing is that they were to develop the illusion that total U.S. disarmament would be a demonstration of moral strength. Now, the disarmament thing is a tactic, because whenever you hear about a country disarming, you know that within a short period of time that they are going to be rearming again. And what does this do? This financially enhances the people who own or are engaged in the military-industrial complex. And so what we either give a whole lot of weapons away just to get rid of them. We've shuffled a lot of our weapons off to South and Central American countries. And then the U.S. government, via the taxpayer, of course, goes out and buys a whole bunch of new ones. And so when it's just a trick. Disarmament leads to rearmament.
Government is a trick.
Yes, it is. Number 4, that the U.S. government would permit free trade between all nations, regardless of their affiliation, whether they were communist, socialist, whatever, free trade. Now, free trade has been in the works since before Lincoln's War. Free trade was something that the early internationalists were going to use to globalize the world. Now, the international bankers have absolutely no allegiances to any country. They are international. And they fund usually both sides of every war. And part of their strategy after a war is to engage in free trade. Now, and we're doing it right now in Iraq, we go into a country, we bomb it to smithereens, then the corporations that are well connected to the Pentagon go in and rebuild the country. And again, often the taxpayers have to foot the bill. And it's a double whammy. You economically debilitate the U.S. and enrich the corporations at the same time.
It's brilliant, and it's so nefarious and odious and everything else I can think of, how they train us like Pavlovian dogs with words like patriotism and nationalism and
well,
peace.
nationalism is a good thing.
Yes, but not the way that they use it to get us to fight their wars for their benefit at our expense.
Well, I don't know that they use patriotism, but nationalism is a totally different thing. Patriotism is what was it? The last refuge of a scoundrel. In other words, they use flags and parades and all kinds, and movies, and they engage Hollywood to make movies that will get the troops all pumped up and ready to go kill somebody. Gotcha. And they also use propaganda in order to vilify the enemy. Now, all of our enemies basically are just people like you and I. They're just trying to feed their families. They're just trying to exist, get along, and they're just like you and I. But that's that's
the reason behind United We Strike. And what I meant by nationalism is just that it's used, I think the government uses it against us. But I believe in building up our nations as well, just not murdering each other for reasons that aren't true.
Sure. And they also, they kind of denigrate words like isolationist, which basically all nations should really be isolationist. In other words, keep your nose out of other nations' business, just like we wouldn't go next door to our neighbors and kind of intervene and see what they're doing and maybe see if we could help them do something better, or maybe impose our religion on them, or impose our way of governing our own home, like, oh, this is the way that we discipline our children, and this is what we do with our children. We would not go next door and attempt to do that with our neighbor. And we should not be doing that with other countries. It's not our business. It's not our right. And it's certainly, most of the time, I don't know of any country that's ever asked for our help to come in and do that. But nonetheless, this is the way that they internationalize this. And so the free trade that develops following a war is basically regulated trade. And any time that you have anything that says free before it, it's going to be regulated, and it's always going to be regulated by the government. Okay, so then you have the extension of long-term loans to Russia, and remember this was back in 1961, to Russia and the Soviet satellites. Now, we always hear that these loans are going to be paid back. Sometimes we don't even know about the loans. And they're never paid back. The U.S. government simply forgives the loans. And it was supposedly, when we went into Iraq, the money that was acquired from the oil resources in Iraq was going to pay for the rebuilding of the country. Now, we certainly haven't heard that for a long time, and we haven't heard, there's no accountability in Washington. They tell you something, they make promises to you, but they never actually come back and say, okay, this is how we handled it. This much money went to this contractor, this much money went to here, and the oil reserves, the resources have brought in this much money. See, they never give us any accountability. They never are responsible to the American people for what they've done with the taxpayers' money. And of course, all they have to do is just have a bunch more printed, and then, we get the burden on our backs.
Yeah, that's very true, and we see with the billion-dollar bonuses that they pass it around to their banker friends, but they certainly can't forgive any of our debts. As a matter of fact, they're foreclosing on people who actually have paid their bills.
Sure.
It's atrocious.
Sure. It definitely is a terrible thing. Okay, so American aid was supposed to go to all these people, and basically that's just redistribution of wealth. And that is all it is. And this occurred in every plan that followed every war. There was the Young Plan in the 1920s that followed World War I. And when we give a loan, like under the Young Plan, we loan this money to a government, such as the German government or one of the Eastern European governments, and we say, okay, here's the loan, but here's the stipulation. You cannot use this money except with the companies we tell you. And the companies always turn out to be Rockefeller or somebody that's highly connected to the government. So basically, you could say that warfare benefits corporations who rebuild after the military has gone in and destroyed.
That's terrible truth. I don't think that the military really understand just how much they are used. As Henry Kissinger said, military men are just dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns in foreign policy.
That's right.
It's a travesty.
That's right. And, of course, the people that join the military are young, and they've been in the government school. They've had the government version of history, and war is glorified in those history books. All war is glorified. The movies glorify it. Textbooks glorify it. The media glorifies it. The music glorifies it. And my goodness, if you don't support the troops, well, there's something obviously morally wrong with you.
You know, I've never understood that. When I watch a war movie, I'm appalled. You know, I never get where there's anything glorious about it at all. I'm missing that chromosome or something.
Well, probably because you're aware of what the objective of the movie is. But this was particularly true for World War I, World War II, and they've always had departments to create propaganda. Whether you're talking about World War I or II, the government has always developed a particular department that handles all propaganda. And right before World War II, or at the beginning of World War II, of course that was before the Pentagon, but the Department of War actually worked in conjunction with Hollywood to develop movies in order to get the troops all ready to go. And this was even before Japan had invaded Pearl Harbor, and which of course the government knew that they were going to do anyway because they'd been provoking it for a couple of years. But I mean, it's just amazing when you go through and you look at history and see how it all comes together, and you think, gosh, how come we didn't know this? How come we're learning this so long after the fact? Okay, so we were supposed to grant recognition of Red China and then admit them to the UN. We were supposed to they were going to set up East and West Germany as separate states in spite of Khrushchev's promise in 1955 to settle the German question by free elections. They were going to prolong the conferences to ban atomic tests because the United States had agreed to suspend tests as long as negotiations were in progress. The U.S. was going to allow all Soviet satellites individual representation in the UN. They were going to promote the UN as the only hope for humankind and demand that it be set up as a one-world government with its own independent armed forces. Now, I don't think that a lot of people understand that when our troops go to fight in various countries, that they are doing it under the auspices of the UN. And many people don't recognize that. Okay, they were going to resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. In other words, the Communists can come in and actively engage in their communist activities and behaviors in this country. Now, this was really institutionalized under Franklin D. Roosevelt. The minute that guy got in, he was sworn in March of 1933, and within 6 months, he had absolutely filled his entire administration with known communist agents. They were known communist agents. And this was deliberate. He knew what he was doing. It was not something that he thought, oh, goodness, these people are just a little left, but I'm sure they'll do a good job. No, these were communist agents. And he immediately started to impose or institute and initiate socialist programs that were designed to make us dependent upon the government. You had Social Security. And remember that this was right at the end of the Great Depression. It was during the Great Depression, but it was right after the 1929 crash, which was deliberate. That was deliberate. It was orchestrated. It was set up. They did it on purpose in order to bring the country down, to destroy the middle class, to seize land and resources from the middle class who were losing, just like it is now. Many people are losing their homes, and those homes will be snatched up for pennies on the dollar by people who have money. And this is exactly what they did right after the 1929 crash. A lot of farmland went into other hands, and it was just basically a redistribution of the wealth under the guise of the stock market crash. And then you had, of course, the Depression, where everybody was just starving, standing in bread lines, and then that was followed by a war. And after every single war, after every single crisis or catastrophe, the government is always, always, always going to impose more legislation to take away a citizen's freedom.
Well, and these are the same, aren't these the same families too, Deanna, who not only the same bloodlines who organized the crash earlier, the so-called Great Depression, which to me is very insulting for them to call it the Great Depression with what they did to the people, and now they're still doing the same game plan today.
Sure. Whether it's the same bloodline, it's if you go back, you will find that that the same names keep cropping up.
Right.
So whether it's bloodline or just generational kinds of things, whether it's the same family of international bankers, certainly the Rockefellers have been around for a long time, the Roosevelts have been around for a long time, and they always seem to be in the forefront of all the things that occur. And like I say, it's all orchestrated. And and of course the Federal Reserve, there was a crash before the Federal Reserve. There was one in 1907. And with each crash, you go back to 1837, there was a crash. 1857, there was a crash. 1873, there was a crash. Then there was one in the 90s. You had the 1893, and then you had the 2000 or the 1907. I'm sorry, I get all my centuries mixed up.
Well, it's the same kind of a deal, just different years.
Right, and of course they demonetized silver in 1873, which caused a crash that was felt worldwide. And now, because you had China and India that were both using the silver standard, and they both used they had bimetallism. They used both gold and silver. And so after 1821, what date was that? 1821. I think that was the year that Great Britain put themselves on the gold standard, which caused a really big glut of silver into the market, which devalued silver, and basically the citizens in China, the citizens in India crashed, basically, because now all of a sudden their money wasn't worth as much. And so people lost their savings. And, when you look at what happened to India and the poverty that is in India, and then you recognize, oh, yeah, they've been under the jurisdiction of Great Britain for, almost 250 years now, 300 years. So that's what the bankers do. Now, remember that I usually start with the banking history in 1694, because that is the date that the Bank of England was chartered, and William Patterson accepted the charter in behalf of the bankers from Amsterdam, Holland. And they came in, and they basically took over the bank, and as soon as they took over the bank, they took over the government. And that is just how it works. As soon as as soon as the bankers take over the currency, they own the government. It doesn't matter whether you've got Republicans in office, whether you've got Democrats in office, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They are just two wings of the same vulture. They both are run and managed by the bankers, the Federal Reserve.
Right. Private interest. And it's amazing that we still succumb to the propaganda, although when you figure that they spend over $200 billion a year on public perception management, they certainly are doing a great job.
Right, right. Well, when the foundations decided, at about the same time the foundations, the tax-free, tax-exempt foundations, came into being about 1913, the same time as the Federal Reserve Act passed. And you also had the ADL. The Neighborists created the ADL at about the same time. And that was
I just wanted to share. I'm sorry, we just have a different deal for, instead of anti-defamation league, I think that we all ought to belong to the anti-defecation league and stop these people from crapping on us.
Oh, that's good. That's good. But this all happened at about the same time, and the reason that they created the Anti-Defamation League was so that people would be silenced. Because as soon as they recognized exactly who was behind the Federal Reserve, well, they would start complaining and dissenting, and so the Anti-Defamation League would silence all of that dissent. And anyway, as soon as the tax-exempt foundations were developed, and that was also in order so that the big money moguls could place their money somewhere else, and they wouldn't have to pay any taxes on it. They could, just put it in a tax-free, tax-exempt foundation, and it was just like taking money from one pocket and putting it into another pocket. It's just that they could use it. They didn't have to pay taxes on it, but they could still use it for whatever purpose that they wanted to. And this is when they got complete control of the school system. And Carnegie was supposed to be in charge of international education, and Rockefeller was to be in charge of domestic education. But they both kind of worked in conjunction with each other, and they made grants to people who appeared to be really good history students, and they would give them a grant, and then these students would go off and they would learn how to teach a particular version of history. And then these people would be placed into the big universities that were like Columbia Teachers College, where they would teach a version of history that was compatible with what the government wanted the students to know, and what who would become teachers then. And so you teach the teachers this false history, and then those teachers go out and they teach the students, and it just goes generation after generation.
Wow. That's how we got into this revisionist form of history, and they certainly are good at what they do.
Sure. And now what you do have is what we do call revisionist history, which is the real history. In other words, okay, let's see, I've looked at this version of history, and I'm studying on my own, and I've revised my concepts, my perceptions about history, so now I've become a revisionist historian, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing to look at what you've been taught and say, I don't think that's true. I'm going to look into it further. I'm going to read a bunch of books that perhaps were printed outside of the country, and see if I can kind of figure out what really happened.
It's great that is right, and it's great that it's still available, because it's going to be harder and harder to find our true history unless we can turn this around. Thank you for all the work and the research that you do, Deanna.
Oh, you're welcome. I want to talk about total war. people don't understand what total war is. And it used to be like during the wars during the Napoleon era, which was right after the French Revolution, which was 1789. We're talking about 1793 to about 1815 or so. And during that period of time, you would have two armies, even in the Revolutionary War. You had two armies. They would be out on a battlefield, and they would oppose each other, and they would fight out there on that battlefield. That's what they did. That was what war was. It had to do with military men on one side fighting military men on the other side. Well, with Lincoln's war, he and his generals implemented what was called total war. Now, there are several commonalities that exist between total war and complete genocide. Total war, number one, total war functions as a catalyst for a premeditated genocide. In other words, for instance, the U.S. government has targeted Iraq. Now, Iraq did have an army. It was a very small, underdeveloped, undersupplied army. The U.S. military didn't go over there and find a nice battlefield and say, okay, you Iraqis go over there, we're going to be here, and let's have this fight. No. Total war means that you go into a country and it's premeditated genocide, because what you're going to do is you are going to deliberately target innocent civilians for massacre. It's genocidal, it's deliberate, and total war means genocide. Nations instigate total war, mass killing, under the guise of national security. It has nothing whatsoever to do with national security. Iraq was not a threat to us. Saddam Hussein was not a threat to us. There was no threat, period. Number 4, genocide and total war are hostile to all humanitarian and Christian principles. Whether you're a Christian or not, if you're ethical, if you have a moral foundation, whether it's a Christian foundation, it doesn't matter. If you have a moral humanitarian foundation, it's hostile. War and total war, genocide, are hostile to all humanitarian principles. And yet we, supposedly a Christian country, are not fighting this horrific charade that our government has us involved in. Christians are supposed to denounce war. And yet you have all these Christians, so-called Christians, picking up a gun, putting on a uniform, just because their government waves a flag.
I know. It's very sad.
Okay, officials appeal to our emotions to initiate genocide and total war. They typically use deceptive information based on scientific or technological factors. They lie, is basically how they get us into war. And that's how they got us into, how Lincoln got us involved in war. That was based on a false flag. The reason we got into the Spanish-American War was based on a false flag. The reason we got into World War I was based on a false flag with the Lusitania. The reason that we got into World War II was because the U.S. government and corporations like Rockefeller provoked Japan because Britain wanted us to be involved in Europe, and Germany and Japan had an alliance. And so Germany wasn't going to come over here and bomb us. They didn't want to do that to begin with. And they didn't start the war. That's a big fallacy. And so you have the U.S. government with their corporations, their well-connected corporations, who are provoking Japan to attack us. They come over and attack us, and then we're in the war. Within minutes, we're in the war. And Roosevelt and Churchill monitored the Japanese progress toward Pearl Harbor from the time they left Japan. They knew that they were going to strike. They knew that there was going to be death, and they allowed it. They allowed it. They stood down. Okay, so you have a false issue there. You look at Vietnam, Tonkin Bay, false flag, didn't happen. Nobody died. Yet we went into Vietnam, killed 3 million of their civilians. Same thing with North Korea, South Korea. You know, it's all based on deception. All of it. And then you have, of course, 9/11. And here we are in another country killing more people so that the corporations can get rich off of other people's misfortune and death.
These are horrible atrocities, and that's what our hope at United We Strike is, and by having wonderful guests like yourself on, is to educate people so they start to think for themselves. One of our earlier guest hosts has a saying of BYOB, which is bring your own brain. And we need to get more people to use their brains now. You know, I don't know how long this will continue. I do know that we've got a strike, a global strike. We're working toward April 15th, 16th, and 17th, and really hope that folks will understand enough to realize that every day we go about our business as usual is a day that we continue to not only allow these atrocities, but we pay for them.
Yes, in more ways than one. We pay for them in our lives. I mean, when you think about the number of people that have been killed in the First World War, 9,911,000 people were killed in action. 21,219,500 people were wounded, and 7,750,000 people were missing in action, for a total in World War I of 38,880,500 lives. 38 million, nearly 39 million lives in one war.
Unconscionable. For the money and power, unconscionable.
And of course, they don't teach this in school. They don't teach it. I never learned this in school, these figures, these facts and figures, because we didn't talk about the logistics. We didn't talk about those kinds of things. It was always about, well, I don't remember. I know it's been a long time since I've been in school, but...
Well, I don't remember them ever teaching us about, giving the Indians infected blankets with a smallpox virus either. The United States likes to just paint over its history and act like we are the saviors of the world, when actually we are just huge imperialists who are run, it seems, by British...
yes. We are not imperialists. They are imperialists. We are the victims here, and we better just wake up. It's the government that's doing this. I mean, I didn't raise my hand when they said, do you want to go to war? Did anybody ask us? Did anybody call you and ask your opinion about whether or not you wanted to pledge some money to go to war? Or whether you wanted to pledge your son's life, or whether you wanted to pledge somebody else's son's life, or somebody else's daughter's life? Did anybody ask us at all? No.
No. They just propagandize us into thinking that our democracy, which really should be a republic, is dependent upon it. It's just a huge farce and a game that we do need to see through, but they've taught us so well, and they've trained us with these systems that have been set up for generations to give away our power. It's hard for a lot of people to think that the military and the police are actually set up just to protect these banking interests.
Right. That is the only reason they're set up. That is their only function. And you can say the same thing about the CIA.
Yeah.
Basically, the CIA is not an intelligence gathering agency. It is an agency that performs bombings and causes disturbances, and they've been very active in doing that basically since they were created from the OSS. And in fact, a lot of the OSS officers went right from that agency right into the CIA. And the CIA, since its formation, since its creation, has killed about 6 million innocent victims in South America, Central America, and in the places where it has functioned. Now that's pretty bad.
It's overwhelming. Yeah, it is overwhelming. And so many good people are still so tied up and so proud of their military service, and they just are not getting the bigger picture, and it's very difficult. You know, I know that my father, who was born in Canada, literally had to go the extra mile to be inducted into the United States service, and he many times would speak of the war when he was alive with such reverence, like it was the good old days. You know, it's amazing to me.
Well, you know, the military has quite an indoctrination program. They teach not only tactics on how to shoot or how to put on a gas mask and try and go through this big long tunnel without breathing but they also teach you doctrine. You have doctrine classes usually all day long, and they teach you military history, their version of military history, and of course it's always glorified. And they basically dehumanize you. When you go into the military, you are no longer an individual. You are part of the herd, and you cannot think for yourself. You cannot. You have to march in line with everybody else. You have to, and if you miss a step, they'll call you on it. And so the military is boot camp is 6 or 8 or 10 weeks, depending on what status you are, is basically just indoctrination and brainwashing. Plus, they shoot you up with a lot of vaccines.
And they'll just plain shoot you if you don't do what they say.
Sure. Or if you decide that you're going to go home like Pat Tillotson, if you're going to go home and spill the beans on what's actually happened.
Yeah, Pat Tillman, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Pat Tillman.
It's okay. Well, Deanna, we are getting close to the end of the show here. I just want to thank you so much. And why don't you let the folks know how they can hear you more often and where to go to find some of your wonderful writing.
Okay, you can go to Spingola.com. SP as in Paul, INGOLA.com. Spingola.com. Or go to republicbroadcasting.org. And I'm on the radio every day from 12 to 2 p.m. Central Standard Time.
That's just Monday through Friday, isn't it? Or are you on Saturday and Sundays?
No, just Monday through Friday.
Okay. Well, I look forward to getting to know you better. I know I'm going to be a guest on February 9th.
Right.
Yeah, and I hope, too, that you learn more about the United We Strike, because, boy, we think that massive, peaceful noncompliance is the best way to get out of here, you know, to make them listen to us. If we don't jump through the hoops, then they'll be stuck doing their own dirty work, and I don't think that would last very long.
Right. Right.
So thank you again on this very first United We Strike Radio Marathon broadcast. Now we've been going since 6 a.m. Pacific time, and we're coming up to a break. So thank you again, Deanna. We're going to say goodbye.
Thank you.
All right, and now we're going to go into a break, and when we come back, we're going to change the topic here and go into community weaving with Cheryl Honey. So stay tuned, folks, for more great radio live coming to you from our own station, United We Strike Radio, on UnitedWeStrike.com and TaxFree15.com.
You're listening to UnitedWeStrike.com radio. Don't buy, don't comply. Ask why. UnitedWeStrike.com radio.
Baptize me in the water, can't you see I'm still your daughter, standing